What if the woman everyone called the most ruthless CEO in Boston was forced to marry the quiet handyman who fixed her grandmother's leaking sink? Eleanor Whitmore spent 10 years building a logistics empire from scratch. She crushed her competitors. She skipped her own birthdays. She slept 4 hours a night. Then her grandmother handed her an ultimatum: marry a stranger, a widowed carpenter, a man with a 6-year-old daughter and a beat-up pickup truck, or watch everything she'd built slip into the hands of the cousin who'd been waiting 20 years for her to fail. Eleanor thought she was lowering herself. She thought she was rescuing a charity case. She had no idea this quiet man with sawdust on his boots was about to teach her something money could never buy, and she had no idea who he really was. Stay with me, because the moment Eleanor figured it out, everything changed. The boardroom on the 30th floor of Whitmore Logistics looked like a cathedral made of glass. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. 34 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history. She wore a charcoal blazer, no jewelry, a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Marcus Hale is moving on us again. That was her CFO, sliding a folder across the table. He's been buying minority shares through 3 different shell accounts. If the board votes next month and we don't have a clean majority, he's going to push you out. Eleanor didn't blink. Then we tighten the perimeter, pull the underperforming routes in the Midwest, buy back our own stock. I want this company sealed shut by Friday. Her executives nodded and scrambled out. The moment the doors closed, her phone buzzed. It was her grandmother. Eleanor, come to the house tonight. Margaret Whitmore was 81 years old, 5'2", a retired school teacher who had quietly held the family's controlling shares for 40 years. She didn't ask twice. That evening, Eleanor drove out to the old Beacon Hill brownstone she'd grown up visiting. Her grandmother was in the sitting room, reading glasses, a cup of tea, a photo album open on her lap. Sit down, sweetheart. Eleanor sat. You're going to lose the company. I'm not going to lose anything, Grandma. Marcus is your cousin, and he's twice as patient as you think. He's been waiting for this moment since you were 12 years old. Eleanor said nothing. She knew it was true. Margaret closed the photo album. I'm holding 51% of the family voting trust. You know this, and I'm prepared to transfer it to you, permanently. Eleanor's heart lifted. But there's a condition. It dropped. 26 years ago, a man named Daniel Brennan saved your grandfather's life, pulled him out of a car off the side of Route 9 in a snowstorm, stayed with him until the ambulance came, refused every penny we offered him in return. Okay. Daniel passed last year, heart attack. He left behind a son, Thomas, a widower with a 6-year-old daughter named Maya. They live in a rented apartment in Dorchester. Thomas works as a carpenter. The girl is small for her age. She lost her mother 2 years ago. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. Grandma, what are you saying? I'm saying I want you to marry Thomas Brennan, quietly, by the end of the month. Eleanor stood up so fast the chair tipped. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. I'm a CEO, I have a board, I have shareholders. You want me to marry a stranger, a carpenter? Margaret looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Then she said something Eleanor never forgot. Eleanor, you've spent 10 years measuring people by what's in their bank account. I'm asking you to spend 6 months learning to measure them by something else. This is blackmail. This is a gift. You just can't see it yet. Eleanor paced the room. And if I refuse, then I'll transfer my shares to a charitable trust. Marcus will get his takeover, and you'll start over. Silence. Eleanor stared at the floor. 10 years of 16-hour days. 10 years of saying no to every dinner, every birthday, every man who'd ever asked her to slow down. All of it on a knife's edge because of a promise her grandfather made in a snowstorm. Where does he live? The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a tired brick walk-up in Dorchester. The hallway smelled like fabric softener and old radiators. Eleanor knocked. The door opened. Thomas Brennan was tall, broader than she expected. Maybe 36, 37. Brown hair that needed a cut, a flannel shirt with sawdust on the cuffs, calm grey eyes that didn't widen at the sight of her tailored coat or the black car waiting on the curb downstairs. Eleanor Whitmore. Yes, Margaret called. Come in. The apartment was small, but it was clean. Spotless, actually. A worn couch. A bookshelf with a lot of paperbacks and a few thick library books on framing and electrical work. A child's drawings taped neatly to the fridge. A little girl peeked around the kitchen doorway, brown hair in 2 crooked braids. A stuffed elephant under one arm. Maya, sweetheart, go finish your snack. I'll be right there. The girl disappeared. Thomas gestured to the kitchen table. They sat across from each other. Eleanor pulled a folder from her bag. I'm going to be direct, Mr. Brennan. This is a contract. I need a husband on paper for 1 year. After that, we file for an amicable divorce. No contest. In exchange, I'll cover Maya's private school tuition through 12th grade. I'll set up a college fund. I'll pay you a stipend of $15,000 a month while we're married. Living expenses, transportation, anything you need. She slid the folder across. He didn't open it. That's a lot of money. It's nothing to me. I noticed. Eleanor looked up. There was no edge in his voice, just a quiet observation, like he was naming a fact about the weather. Mr. Brennan. Thomas. I don't have time for this to be complicated. My grandmother thinks she's doing something noble. I think she's wasting both of our time. But the company I built is on the line, and I need this signed by Friday. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the kitchen, where Maya was humming to herself. Can I ask you something? Sure. What are you going to tell my daughter? When she asks why a strange woman is suddenly her stepmother. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. She hadn't thought about that. I'd say it's an arrangement, a friendly one. We don't have to lie. We just don't have to explain everything. She's 6. She doesn't know what an arrangement is. She knows what a mom is. She lost hers 2 years ago. Eleanor felt a small, unfamiliar tightness in her chest. I'm not asking you to be her mother, Thomas. I'm asking you to live in a guest wing of my house for 12 months. Sign a piece of paper. That's it. He nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Come back tomorrow night, 6 o'clock. I'll have an answer. She stood up. Mr. Brennan, I don't have time to. Thomas, I don't have time to wait. He stood up too. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly. Then maybe this isn't the right deal for you. Eleanor stared at him. In 10 years of negotiations, no one had ever made her wait. 6 o'clock, she said, and walked out. She came back the next night. Thomas opened the door before she knocked. I'll do it on 3 conditions. Name them. 1, I keep working. I'm not quitting my job. I'll come to your events when you need me to, but I'm not your kept man. Fine. 2, Maya doesn't move into your house. We stay in the apartment for the first 3 months. You can visit. You can spend time with her. But you're not uprooting a kid who's already lost too much. Eleanor wanted to argue. The optics would be terrible. But she saw the look on his face and didn't. Fine, we'll commute. 3. The $15,000 a month doesn't go to me. It goes into a trust for Maya, untouched until she's 25. Eleanor blinked. You don't want any of it? No. Why? He looked at her for a long second. Because I'm not selling my daughter, a stepmother. She didn't have an answer for that. She handed him the pen. He signed. The ceremony was at City Hall. 12 minutes long. Eleanor wore a cream suit. Thomas wore a navy jacket that Eleanor was pretty sure he'd borrowed from a friend. Maya was there in a pink dress, holding a small bouquet of grocery store daisies. She watched the proceedings with serious, careful eyes. When the officiant said the words, Thomas turned to Eleanor. You okay? She nodded. He didn't kiss her. He just gave her a small, kind nod and turned to lift Maya onto his hip. Her grandmother was the only family witness. Margaret looked at Eleanor with an expression that was half pride, half something Eleanor couldn't quite read. After the ceremony, they took Maya for ice cream at a place Thomas knew, 2 blocks from the courthouse. Eleanor sat in a vinyl booth across from a 6-year-old who was studying her over a chocolate cone. You're tall, Maya said. I am. My mum was tall. Eleanor's throat tightened. What was she like? Maya thought about it, carefully. She liked to sing. She wasn't very good at it. Daddy says she was the best at not being good at things. Eleanor looked across the booth at Thomas. He was watching his daughter with a softness that didn't match the calm, cool man who'd negotiated her contract. For the first time, Eleanor wondered if she'd just walked into something larger than she'd planned. The arrangement was supposed to be invisible. Thomas drove in from Dorchester 3 nights a week. He stayed in the guest wing of Eleanor's brownstone in the South End. He left at 6 a.m. to get back to Maya before her school bus. Eleanor, predictably, almost never saw him. She was at the office until 10 most nights, eating salads at her desk, fighting Marcus Hale on 5 different fronts. Marcus had figured out something was happening. He couldn't prove it, but he was asking questions, sending people to investigate. The story of a sudden, quiet marriage was the kind of thing he'd weaponize the second he could. So Eleanor needed Thomas at the company gala. 3 weeks after the wedding, the biggest networking event of the year, she told him on a Thursday night. He was in the kitchen of her brownstone, the night he stayed over, eating a sandwich he'd made himself. She still had a private chef. He'd politely declined the chef's services every single time. Saturday night, Eleanor said. The Whitmore Logistics Annual Gala, black tie. The whole board will be there. Marcus will be there. Thomas nodded. Okay. You don't have to talk to anyone. Just stand next to me, smile, look like a husband. I can do that. And we should probably get you a suit, a real one. I'll have someone. I have a suit, Eleanor. She paused. You have a tuxedo? I have a dark suit. It'll be fine. She didn't argue. She made a mental note to have a backup option in the car just in case. Saturday night, Eleanor came down the staircase of her brownstone in a deep green dress. Thomas was waiting in the foyer. He was wearing a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, white shirt, a simple dark tie. His hair was combed, his shoes were polished. He looked, frankly, like a different man. He looked like a man who knew exactly how to dress for a room full of millionaires. Eleanor stopped on the 3rd step. Where did you get that suit? I told you I have a suit. That's not an off-the-rack suit, Thomas. He gave her a small, neutral smile. It was a gift, a long time ago. She wanted to ask more. The car was waiting. She let it go. For now. The Boston Public Library was lit up like a cathedral. Marble floors, crystal, a string quartet, 200 of the most powerful people in New England moving through the room like sharks in evening wear. The moment Eleanor and Thomas walked in, the whispers started. That's him. Who is he? Where did she find him? Eleanor felt every eye in the room on her. She kept her chin up. Thomas was steady beside her. His hand on the small of her back was warm and unhurried. Breathe, he said quietly. You're allowed to breathe. She glanced at him. You've done this before. I've been to weddings. That's not what I mean. He didn't answer. Marcus Hale found them within 20 minutes. He was 42, slick, always tan, always smiling the smile of a man who'd been told all his life that he was charming. He came with 2 of his deputies in tow. Eleanor, darling, you look absolutely radiant. Marcus. And this must be, I'm sorry, what's your name again? My memory. Thomas. Thomas. Right. Marcus turned to one of his deputies, smiling. Tom does some kind of construction work, I believe. Is that right? Carpentry, Thomas said. Carpentry. Wonderful, honest work. The deputies snickered, the way men snicker when they're being told they're allowed to. Eleanor felt her hand tighten around her champagne glass. But Thomas didn't react. He just looked at Marcus, politely, patiently, the way you might look at a child who was about to embarrass himself. Tell me, Tom, Marcus said, do you know what an EBITDA margin is? Or are we keeping the dinner conversation closer to, oh, I don't know, sandpaper? A few people nearby pretended not to listen and listened harder. Thomas took a slow sip of his water. EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation and amortization. It's a way of looking at operating profitability without the noise of capital structure. Useful, but it's been criticized, fairly I think, for letting companies hide a lot of real costs. Buffett famously called it a pernicious metric for that reason. Marcus's smile froze. What does that mean? Thomas continued mildly, in the context of your last 3 quarters at Hale Capital. Well, it means your top line looks healthier than your free cash flow does, which is the kind of thing a board notices when they pay attention. The 2 deputies stopped snickering. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Where did you go to school, Tom? State school, a long time ago. Excuse us, Eleanor said smoothly, taking Thomas's arm and steering him away. She didn't speak until they were in a quiet alcove behind a marble pillar. What was that? He was being rude. Thomas, carpenters do not casually quote Warren Buffett on EBITDA at black tie events. Some do. Thomas. He looked at her, the same calm grey eyes, but something behind them she couldn't read. I read a lot, Eleanor. That wasn't reading. That was a takedown. It was a sentence. She stared at him. Who are you? I'm your husband on paper, for another 11 months. That's not what I'm asking. He held her eyes for a long second. Then he said very gently, ask me what you actually want to know, when you're ready. And he walked off to find a glass of water, leaving her standing in the alcove with her heart pounding, for reasons she couldn't quite name. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her bedroom and ran the conversation back, line by line. The suit, the posture, the way Marcus's smile had cracked. She got out of bed at 4 a.m. She made coffee. She opened her laptop. She ran a basic search. Thomas Brennan, Boston, carpenter. Nothing useful. A LinkedIn page that hadn't been updated in years, a rental lease, a few old construction permits. She tried his late wife's name, Sarah Brennan, Boston, deceased. A short obituary. 2 years ago, she'd been 32, breast cancer, survived by her husband Thomas and her daughter Maya. Eleanor read the obituary 3 times. There was nothing strange about it, nothing hidden, just a young woman who had died too soon, and the family she'd left behind. Eleanor closed her laptop. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was the one who didn't understand the room. The next Saturday, Eleanor drove out to Dorchester, unannounced. She told herself she was checking in, doing her duty as a contractually obligated wife. She told herself it had nothing to do with what Thomas had said at the gala. Maya answered the door. "Hi, Eleanor." "Hi, Maya. Is your dad home?" "He's in the back. He's fixing Mrs. Petrov's chair." "Can I come in?" Maya nodded gravely and stepped aside. The apartment looked the same. But Eleanor noticed things this time. The bookshelf. Closer up, the books weren't just paperbacks. There were old hardcovers too. The Federalist Papers, a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a book on Federal Reserve history, a framed photo on the wall that she hadn't noticed before. Thomas, much younger, in a graduation robe, standing next to a smiling older man with the same grey eyes. Eleanor walked toward it. "That's my grandpa," Maya said. "He died before I was born. Daddy says he was the smartest man he ever knew." Eleanor leaned closer. The robe wasn't a state school robe. The crest on the sleeve was unmistakable. It was Princeton. "Maya," Eleanor said very carefully, "where did your dad go to college?" Maya thought about it. "Princeton. And then he did more school after that. But he doesn't like to talk about it. He says it doesn't matter." Eleanor stared at the photo. The back door opened. Thomas walked in, carrying a chair, a screwdriver in his teeth. He stopped when he saw her. He took the screwdriver out of his mouth. "Eleanor." "Princeton." He didn't move. Maya looked between them, sensing the air change. "Maya, sweetheart, can you give me and Eleanor a minute? Go pick out a book for after lunch." Maya disappeared down the hall. Thomas set the chair down. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for her to do the same. "Yes, I went to Princeton. Then I got an MBA at Wharton." Eleanor sat. "Why are you a carpenter, Thomas?" He took a slow breath. "Because 4 years ago, I was an investment banker in New York. I was 32 years old. I was running a desk that managed about $2 billion in pension funds. Most of that money belonged to teachers, firefighters, hospital workers. People who weren't rich, people who were trusting us to be careful with their retirement." Eleanor was very still. "My boss wanted us to move a large position into a structured product that I knew was overvalued. I told him no. I wrote a memo. I documented everything. He went around me. He pushed it through anyway. The product blew up 6 months later. Pensions lost 12% of their value almost overnight. Some people lost almost everything." "Thomas." "The firm protected itself. They paid a fine. The man who pushed the trade got promoted. I was the one who'd written the memo, so they made me the fall guy. Public hearings. My name in the Wall Street Journal. A 2-year SEC investigation that eventually cleared me, but by then nobody cared. I never heard about." "You weren't supposed to." The firm settled quietly. Sealed records, standard playbook. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who built things. By the time it was over, Sarah was sick. We moved back to Boston to be near her family. I was done with finance, done with watching smart people lie to themselves to make a quarterly number. I'd grown up doing carpentry with my dad on weekends. I started taking jobs, cabinets, decks, renovations. People paid me cash. I didn't have to wear a tie. I came home for dinner every night. Eleanor felt something heavy settle in her chest. Sarah died 18 months later. It was very fast. Maya was 4. After that, he shook his head. After that, the carpentry was the only thing keeping me sane. I built her bookshelves. I built her bed. I built the kitchen table you're sitting at. She looked down, ran her hand along the wood. Thomas, why did you say yes to my grandmother? He was quiet for a long time. Because Maya needs college someday. Because Margaret Whitmore wrote me a letter after Sarah died, and she included a $5,000 check. And she said your grandfather would have wanted us to have it. We didn't cash it, but I never forgot the letter. He paused. And because your grandmother told me, Eleanor, that you were on a path that was going to leave you very alone, and she was hoping, very gently, that I might know something about not being alone, that maybe I could pass it along. Eleanor felt her eyes sting. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. She told you that? She told me she was worried about you. Eleanor looked at the kitchen table. The photo of the man in the Princeton robe, the little drawings on the fridge. I came here, she said quietly, thinking I was rescuing a charity case. I know. You knew what I thought of you. From the first night. I knew. And you said yes anyway. I said yes because of Maya, and because Margaret asked. The rest of it, I figured we'd get to, or we wouldn't. Eleanor wiped her eye with the back of her hand. Quickly, like she was annoyed it had happened. What do I do now? Thomas looked at her with that same calm. You have lunch with us. Maya made grilled cheese. They're not very good, but she's proud of them. Eleanor laughed. The sound surprised her. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Okay. After that Saturday, things were different. Not all at once, slowly. Eleanor started leaving the office at 7, then 6. She started driving herself to Dorchester on Sundays. Sometimes she'd help Maya with a puzzle. Sometimes she'd just sit on the couch and read while Thomas worked in the back room, and Maya watched cartoons. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. One Sunday, she brought a book of her own, The Brothers Karamazov. She'd been meaning to read it for 15 years. Thomas saw it on the coffee table and raised an eyebrow. Dostoevsky on a Sunday. My father loved this book. I never finished it. It gets better in the second half. You've read it? In college. Of course you have. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It changed his whole face. Marcus Hale moved faster than anyone expected. 6 weeks before the annual board vote, he made a public play. He bought a major minority stake in Whitmore Logistics through an open market filing. He gave an interview to a Boston business magazine. He was positioning himself as the modern, aggressive alternative to Eleanor's old-fashioned leadership. The article hit on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 3 of Eleanor's largest institutional investors had called to express concerns. Eleanor sat in her office on Friday night, staring at the city. Her phone buzzed. It was Thomas. Maya's asking if you want to come for dinner tomorrow. She closed her eyes. Thomas, I might lose the company. A pause. I'm sorry. What happened? She told him. She didn't know why she was telling him. She just was. She told him about Marcus, about the filings, about the institutional investors, about the cousin who'd been waiting 20 years. Thomas listened. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, he said, Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Okay. What does Marcus actually want? The company. No. What does he actually want? She paused. He wants to prove he's better than me. He's wanted that since we were kids. Right. So what does he need from the institutional investors to do that? He needs them to think I'm unstable, that my judgment can't be trusted. Has your judgment actually been bad? No. Has the company been performing better than ever? Then your problem isn't your numbers, Eleanor. It's your story. Marcus has a story. You don't. Tell them what you've actually built. Bring them out to a warehouse. Show them. Don't fight him on his ground. Fight him on yours. Eleanor wrote it down. She wrote down every word. The following week, she did exactly what Thomas had said. She invited her 3 biggest investors to a tour. Not a boardroom, a working warehouse outside Worcester, the one that had been her father's first depot 40 years ago. She walked them through it herself, in flat shoes, without the slides. She showed them the dispatch room, the driver's break area, the training program she'd built for inner-city kids, the on-site daycare she'd quietly funded for the last 6 years. She didn't mention Marcus once. By the end of the tour, all 3 investors had committed to voting their shares with her at the board meeting. When she got back to the brownstone that night, Thomas was on the couch reading. Maya was already asleep upstairs. Eleanor sat down next to him. I did what you said. And it worked. He smiled. I'm not surprised. She looked at him for a long moment. Thomas, I have a question. Okay. How many people have you helped like this? Quietly, without taking credit. He thought about it. A few. How many? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. He set the book down. I'm friends with a couple of people. From the old days, people who run things now. When something comes across my desk that I can pass along, I pass it along. Sometimes I make a call. Sometimes I introduce 2 people who should know each other. I don't take a fee. I don't put my name on it. I just try to make sure the right people get a fair shot. You're a quiet philanthropist. I'm a guy who fixes chairs and sometimes gives a friend a heads up. Thomas. Eleanor. She looked at him. You don't get to keep being invisible. Not to me. He held her eyes. Okay, he said softly. Okay. Marcus didn't take losing the institutional investors well. He spent the next 3 weeks calling in every favor he had. He approached 2 of Eleanor's senior vice presidents and offered them seats on his future board. He hired a PR firm. He started leaking quiet, ugly stories. A reporter from the Globe called Eleanor on a Tuesday afternoon. Ms. Whitmore, I'm working on a piece about the Hale Whitmore family situation, and I wanted to give you a chance to comment on a story I've been told by multiple sources. What story? That your recent marriage was arranged by your grandmother for the express purpose of securing her shares, that your husband has no professional background, that this raises serious governance concerns about your fitness as CEO. Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. Who are your sources? I can't reveal that, but I will say I have it from 3 independent people. She knew exactly who. Marcus had 3 deputies. I'll have a statement to you by tomorrow morning. She hung up. She sat at her desk for a long time. Then she called Thomas. He's going public with the marriage. He's framing it as a sham. A pause. Are you asking me what to do? I'm asking you what you'd do. Another pause. Eleanor, I'd tell the truth. The truth? The whole truth. That your grandmother put the deal together. That you initially agreed to it for business reasons. That what's happened since is something neither of us expected. You don't have to perform a love story. Just say what's real. Thomas, that'll humiliate me. It might. Or it might be the most respected thing you ever say. She thought about it for a long time. I want you next to me when I do it. Okay. The press conference was Thursday morning. Eleanor's office. 20 reporters. Cameras. She wore a grey suit. No makeup tricks. Her hair pulled back simply. Thomas stood beside her in his dark suit, calm as ever. Eleanor stepped to the microphone. She didn't read from notes. 6 months ago, my grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, asked me to consider marrying a man I'd never met. His name is Thomas Brennan. His father, 26 years ago, saved my grandfather's life and refused to take any reward for doing it. My grandmother believed that some debts run longer than a generation. The room was completely quiet. I agreed to the marriage initially for 2 reasons. The first was sentimental. The second was practical. My grandmother controls 51% of the family voting trust, and her support was important to me at a moment when this company was facing a hostile push from a member of my own extended family. A few reporters wrote faster. That was the deal we agreed to. I want to say that publicly because I think you deserve to hear it from me, not from someone whispering in your ear off the record. She paused. What I did not expect, when I drove out to Dorchester to meet a man I assumed was a stranger, was that he would turn out to be one of the most thoughtful, decent, and quietly impressive people I have ever known. Thomas is a former investment banker. He left Wall Street 4 years ago because he refused to participate in a transaction he believed would harm public pension holders. He took the harder, quieter road. He now works as a carpenter and raises his daughter, Maya, on his own. His late wife, Sarah, passed away 2 years ago. A reporter raised a hand. Eleanor kept going. I am telling you all of this because there is a version of this story being shopped to several of you right now that suggests our marriage is a fraud and that I am unfit to lead this company. The first part is more complicated than a yes or no, and I've just told you why. The second part is simply not true. This company has had its strongest 2 years in its history under my leadership. The numbers are public. You can read them. She looked around the room. I have one last thing to say. The person who is leaking this story to you is doing so because he believes the only way he can win this fight is by making me look small. I'd rather lose this company on my own merits than win it by playing his game. So I'm going to stand here, tell you the truth, and trust that the people who own shares in this company can make up their own minds. She stepped back. The room exploded with questions. She took a few. She answered them honestly. When it was done, she walked out the side door. Thomas was waiting. He didn't say anything. He just took her hand. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor let someone take her hand. The board vote was 11 days later. Marcus made his pitch. 40 minutes, slides, charts, aggressive numbers. Eleanor made hers in 12 minutes. She talked about the warehouse in Worcester, the training program, the driver retention rate, which was the highest in the industry, the customers who'd been with the company for 30 years. She talked about her father, who'd started the business with 2 trucks. She didn't talk about Marcus once. When the vote was tallied, Eleanor had won, 63%. It wasn't close. Marcus left the building without saying goodbye to anyone. Eleanor walked back to her office. Thomas wasn't there. He didn't come to the office. He'd never come to the office. But there was a small package on her desk. She opened it. It was a wooden box, hand-cut, hand-sanded, hand-finished, the grain of the wood polished until it almost glowed. Inside the box was a single folded note. For your pens, T. Eleanor sat down at her desk and held the box in both hands and cried for the first time in 11 years. The marriage contract was for 1 year. By the end of month 9, Eleanor and Thomas had not had a single conversation about what would happen at month 12. Neither of them wanted to be the one to bring it up. It was Maya in the end who broke the silence. It was a Sunday afternoon. Eleanor was on the couch in the Dorchester apartment, helping Maya with a long division worksheet. Thomas was making dinner. Maya looked up from her paper. Eleanor. When are you going to live with us all the time? Eleanor's pencil stopped. She looked toward the kitchen. Thomas had gone very still over the cutting board. Maya, sweetheart, that's a grown-up question. Your dad and I are still figuring some things out. Why? Because grown-ups make things complicated. Maya considered that. I asked Daddy if you were going to be my new mum forever, and he said it was up to you. Eleanor felt every muscle in her body go quiet. She stood up, walked to the kitchen. Thomas didn't turn around. He kept slicing onions very precisely. Thomas, I didn't mean to put that on you. You didn't. I shouldn't have said anything to her. Thomas, look at me. He set down the knife and turned. His eyes were shinier than usual. I told her that because it was true, he said quietly. It is up to you. Up to me to what? Up to you to decide if a year is enough, or if you want this to be something else. Eleanor took a slow breath. I have a question. Okay. When the contract started, you said you weren't selling Maya a stepmother. So I want to ask you, honestly, have you been doing what you've been doing for the last 9 months because of the contract? Or for some other reason? He looked at her. Eleanor, the contract ended for me about 3 months ago. I just didn't know how to tell you. She took a step closer. Why didn't you? Because I didn't want you to feel pressured. You agreed to 1 year for business reasons. I wasn't going to use a 6-year-old to renegotiate. Thomas. Eleanor. She put her hand on the side of his face. He closed his eyes. I've been a CEO for 10 years, she said. I know how to make a decision, and the decision I'm making right now is that I do not want a divorce. Are you sure? I am very sure. He smiled slowly. Then, finally, after almost a year of marriage, Thomas Brennan kissed his wife. Maya, watching from the living room, made a face and went back to her long division worksheet. The annual Whitmore Logistics holiday party was in early December. Eleanor stood at the front of the warehouse. The same warehouse she'd taken her investors to 2 years earlier, and gave a 5-minute speech to 400 employees and their families. She thanked the dispatchers. She thanked the drivers. She thanked the people who packed the boxes and the people who answered the phones. She didn't talk about herself once. When she was done, she stepped down from the small stage. Thomas was waiting at the back, holding Maya's hand. Maya was now 7, and proudly wearing a small red dress. Margaret Whitmore was sitting in a chair off to the side, 82 years old now, watching her granddaughter with an expression that, this time, Eleanor could finally read. It was simple. It was I knew. Eleanor walked over. She hugged her grandmother gently. She kissed the top of her head. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret patted her hand. For what, dear? For not letting me become someone I didn't want to be. Margaret smiled. Sweetheart, you were never going to be that person. You just needed someone to remind you. A few weeks later, Eleanor was cleaning out an old desk drawer in her office. She found her copy of the original marriage contract. She held it for a moment. Then she walked to the shredder and fed it through, page by page. She kept the wooden box Thomas had made her. It still sat on her desk. It still held her pens. So, Eleanor Whitmore thought she was the powerful one in that arrangement. She thought a quiet man in a flannel shirt was beneath her, and what she learned was something she'd somehow forgotten in 10 years of climbing, that the measure of a person isn't what they own. It isn't where they went to school. It isn't the title on their door. The measure of a person is how they treat the people they have nothing to gain from, how they raise their kids, how they tell the truth when the truth is expensive, how they refuse to participate in something they know is wrong, even when refusing costs them everything. Thomas Brennan didn't save Eleanor Whitmore by being secretly rich. He saved her by being openly decent, and in return she did something she'd been afraid to do for a very long time. She let someone in. If this story moved you, even a little, leave a comment and tell me about a quiet person in your life who turned out to be the most important one in the room. Hit subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one. New ones every week. And the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit the picture you had in your head, slow down. Look again. You might be standing in front of someone who's about to change your whole life.